Hi, I'm Ben, your faithful skeptic, and I've been thinking about a very common objection to Christianity, the Bible, faith, all of that stuff. It doesn't even have to be Christianity, just faith. And that objection actually came from someone who I actually do believe would confess some kind of faith, but I think is something that literally anyone struggles with in that kind of monotheistic framework. I'm going to try to address it relatively concisely today. And that question is God good? Yeah, this is like my fourth or fifth video I've ever recorded, and I'm basically biting off the biggest thing I could ever bite off. But hey, whatever. This is Amateur Hour. Welcome to the show. So, is God good? Well, when a question comes up like that, let's start with defining terms. Okay, I think we all know what the definition of is, so we'll move that beyond that one. For this purpose, I was talking to somebody in the deep south. Somebody's working in a environment surrounded by a lot of Christians. The owners are Christian, things like that. So I'm going to assume that this person is referring to the God of the Bible, right? The God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So this would also cover Jews. I won't get into Islam yet, so just put that aside. So relevant for anyone who leans Jewish or Christian, right? Or knows anyone who does or is in that kind of framework. So most of America, this could apply to. So the God we're talking about here is Yahweh, right? Let's just say that. It's Yahweh or Jehovah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Good. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of things. So is God good? Well, the question is, what do you mean by good? When I was trying to think about this today in the shower and kind of throughout the day, where I kind of got stuck was, okay, we first need to kind of determine, like, what is good, right? Now, I'm not going to try to be all Pontius Pilate here and say what is truth. And as a scoffer, I'm just trying to think, kind of, what are the two basic frameworks we can approach this good question from, right? And the way I see it is you basically have two options, right? You have relative or objective, right? Relativism or objectivism. So if you're kind of new to the philosophy thing, this is what I'm talking about. If goodness is derived purely from a relative standard, it would mean that nobody kind of has the final say, the trump card, if you will, on goodness, right? It's not God, it's not any one person. Goodness is just a construct that we human beings who have evolved from slime or sludge or whatever have come up with as a way to talk about things that really, there's no objective thing. There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about any action. The goodness is kind of from the eye of the beholder, right? I think C.S. Lewis wrote a terrific book about this, and I can't remember which one it was. But go check it out. All kinds of people have talked about this. Versus objective, right? Where the goodness of the action or the thing is apart from it. It's not just from in the eye of the beholder. It's actually good. And if this is new to you, this might be kind of weird, but relativism and objectivism, they kind of lead two different directions. They lead in two different, completely opposite directions. So objectivism is almost a little bit easier to understand. It's basically, it's bad because someone said so, right? In a theistic kind of worldview that we're talking about here, right? Because the question is God good? Well, if God is the ultimate definer of good, then it's really easy to answer this question in a trite and very unhelpful and unsatisfying way, which is, well, yeah, because he defines good, therefore he's good, right? Because what's the other standard that we're going to judge an action based on its goodness? If you go the relative route, though, well, like I said, there's no actual goodness. Goodness doesn't really exist. It's just something we talk about, right? We're all just a bunch of neurons, right? And what you end up with is goodness and badness kind of become more about preference, right? We don't like it. We call it bad because we don't like it. Or we like this thing, so we call it good, right? But you can't say that pickle ice cream is evil, even though it would probably be abhorrent to human taste. It would still, most likely, not be considered evil, right? Because it's a matter of preference, right? Who's to say that my taste buds are more able to objectify or create a sense of goodness or badness than anyone else's taste buds? So you see the problem. Now, as applied to God, let's think about where this would go. Let's look at both of these frameworks real quick. if there is no objective standard for goodness based on God or the Bible or anything like that, then you get into this weird situation where, like Richard Dawkins, he'll point out he's a very aggressive atheist, and he'll point out that God is a moral monster because look at all the people he murdered in the Old Testament, right? And it's a common objection. Look at all the bad things God did in the Old Testament. But if there is no such real thing as good and bad, and it's just a matter of opinion ultimately, then why is that bad? It sounds kind of weird, right? And that's why relativism gets kind of confusing. But why is something bad if it's just a matter of opinion? It's really not. Like, who's to say that God murdering all of the Amorites is bad via the people, or killing billions of people in a worldwide flood? Yeah, and I think it really was billions of people. But you get my point, right? It just becomes a matter of opinion, in which case goodness and badness, the words kind of stop making sense. So let's just assume, let's kind of put that to the side of, my worldview is, well, good and bad exists, right? And I would challenge anybody to tell me how torturing babies for fun is ever not evil. And this is something I've brought up. If I've ever spoken with you about this subject before, you might remember when I asked you this. If you're someone who's a relative, I'll ask you, so you're saying torturing babies for fun isn't evil, right? Now, you might think it's bad. You might dislike it. You might think it's evil. But if you don't believe in objective morality, that the rules exist outside of the game, in a sense, then you can't really say that it's evil. It's just a matter of opinion, just a difference of opinion, right? And I think deep down we all know that. We all have a sense of justice. We all have a sense of when we've been wronged, it's not just I didn't like it. It's like, no, that's not the way it should be, right? Ideas like justice don't make any sense. So super quickly, I'm trying to essentially provide a couple different ways to think about, well, what are the logical conclusions of good and evil being relative versus good and evil being objective? And, human sense, if you look at morality, it's actually almost near universal in terms of the rules that everyone has. That's not necessarily an argument for or against relativism or objectivism. I'm just saying I think that is a support for I think it fits objectivism a little bit better. But before we go into an hour-long conversation about this, I'm going to go with objectivism, right? And again, we're kind of coming at it from a theistic perspective here. Is God good? Therefore, it kind of makes sense to come up from an objective perspective. And we'll just kind of make the term, define this as, well, his house has rules, right? If God created the universe and he created natural laws, then why couldn't he have created moral laws? That doesn't solve the question of is God good. I'm just saying, let's just move forward with this objective thing as it accepts. Hopefully that wasn't too loud for the microphone. Okay. So how are we going to determine is God good? Well, I'm kind of looking at three different lines of reasoning here. And the first is the Bible, okay? Now you might say, hey, that's cheating. We don't believe the Bible because I'm a skeptic. Well, okay, that's fine, but you're also asking, is God good? So I'm going to say, like, kind of within the framework of the Bible, is God good, right? Well, I can't think of any verses off the top of my head, but considering that God is establishing from Genesis, early in Genesis or throughout Genesis, the rules for kind of human behavior, and then you get into Exodus, which happens thousands of years later, where God is establishing the Ten Commandments and these rules for the Jewish people. Again, go look it up. Don't believe me, but I'm probably not saying anything controversial here. Then what we get into is, okay, God is establishing these standards of human behavior, and later on, he condemns certain activities done by the Jewish people in many of the books of the prophets. You can just read like any of them, right? One of them being idolatry is bad. Don't worship other idols. So in this situation, we're looking at, well, if God defined good and bad, if you believe the Bible, then yeah, God is good, right? Because the Bible is like what he said. Again, if we believe the Bible, okay, you skeptics, I acknowledge you, all right? But I'm just saying, if you swallow that the Bible is a reliable transmission of God's words to us today, Yahweh's words to people today, then you'd kind of have to also take well, is God good? Now, what's interesting is even for people of faith, you're very dissatisfied with that. Now, why? Like, why, right? Because I just gave you, Look, just read the whole Bible. The whole thing basically says God is good, people aren't, like, right? But what's the challenge? Well, there's a disconnect between what we think, right? Like, oh yeah, okay, I can put these little logical propositions together, and what we experience. And I think that's where this question usually almost always comes from, right? Sometimes it comes from really just the philosophical, let's just break this down, but I think in this case it's really asking about, but my human experience doesn't support this idea that God is good, right? So let's quick jump into that, and then we'll try to close so this video doesn't run on forever. So let's look at the world. Let's just look, kind of globally at the world, right? That's where usually people go to with this question when they're well-meaning, right? If God is good, then what's up with the world, right? Why is the world just a god-awful mess, pun intended? Okay? Now, we're going to get into some Bible here. I'm going to just explain it because I'm going to be, I don't know if this is really inductive or deductive or not, but I'm just going to say, look, let me explain to you the kind of the Christian view on this, why Christians believe, despite what we see in the world today, that, yeah, God is actually good, right? So let's take a look at this for a second. So this is Genesis 1, right? It's the first book of the Bible, first chapter of the first book of the Bible. And the word we're really looking for here is very, where is it? Very good. There we go. Verse 31 right there. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Okay? Now, when you look at the world today, I don't think anyone could really say in all honesty, look, the world is very good, because we know it's not. Like everybody deep down knows the world is not good. And yes, I'm pleading to universal human experience here as my evidence. The world isn't good. The world is broken. The world is messed up. We have disease and famine and children dying, right? I don't know in any situation where, children dying on a regular basis is like this super good thing for no reason, right? For no purpose, right? So, well, there's a purpose in everything, but what's the challenge here? So where's the disconnect, right? Well, one of the things that we read, and I'm not going to get into it, the whole thing right here, is in Genesis 1, again, if we are people of faith, or we're willing to accept, just for the sake of argument, that Genesis is a reliable account of how God created everything, then what we're looking at here is that God created the universe in a certain ordered and structured way, and by the end of it, and he called it good. Every time he kind of built something on top of it, he built it and built it and built it, and then by the end of it, he called it very good. Right? So something must have happened to break the world. And that's where we see Genesis 3. And we can get into that whole thing, but we can get to death and the curse. Keep going. Genesis 3. So there's this whole conversation that happens, and God curses the serpent, right? He brings a judgment upon the woman. He brings a judgment upon the man. Now look at this. Just look at 17 real quick. And unto Adam he, that's God talking, said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the fruit of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. So whether or not you believe it's true, perhaps, what we're seeing here in Genesis 3:17 is that prior to this point, the ground is not cursed, right? Because now it's cursed. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life, in sorrow. So there was eating without sorrow prior to this point. Something changed. Something happened, right? Are you following me here? And this is something that even a lot of Christians really, really get confused on, right?